Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Hotcorn. I'm delighted today to have an opportunity to chat with Nick de Semlyen, our very own wild and crazy guy, who is also the author of this book, which is going to be mirrored because I've mirrored my screen. But the Wild and Crazy Guys, How the Comedy Mavericks of the 80s Changed Hollywood Forever. So thank you very much, Nick, for agreeing to chat with me.
Thanks for having me on, and very good job with the name. My name is not quite as difficult to pronounce as Dr. Ha 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 Ha, but it's like just behind it.
Which of course is the Steve Martin, the man with two brains.
Yes.
That was one of the things actually I didn't want to start with this, but it's a good introduction. I was really surprised at how those movies that I always think of as the best Steve Martin movies, The Man with Two Brains, The Jerk, and Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, weren't particularly successful. The Jerk was, but did that surprise you as you sort of approached the subject?
It did a bit. I mean, I think one of the joys of the book was trying to kind of follow the emotional through lines of these people. So following them through their highs and lows, and those don't always sync up with what you think they're going to sync up with. Like, you look back and they're these classic, hilarious films, and you assume that they were all big hits and everyone loved them. But actually, yeah, with Steve Martin, The Jerk was huge, and then he had this really fallow patch where he was doing incredible work, but people just weren't responding to it for whatever reason, and he was trying all these different experiments and not really getting anywhere with it. But yeah, those are three very, very funny films which really hold up.
What made the 80s such a ripe period for this sort of cinema comedy?
I think there are a few things. I think it's the sort of the confluence of these people together, which and I guess Saturday Night Live was a big part of that, just bringing them all together and them all kind of, all the crossovers and all working together and doing all these different kind of experimental things. But then just in a broader sense, I think Hollywood was more experimental itself at that time. I think that people would give huge budgets to things like the Blues Brothers, which I don't think would happen today. Ghostbusters, seems like of course the Ghostbusters would be big, but back then that was kind of a crazy thing that could have backfired. If you look at Nothing But Trouble, it could have been another Nothing But Trouble potentially. So I think it was a few things. I think it was just like that environment at the time that people would take risks on these guys, and they were quite out of control. A lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, we've already mentioned it with Steve Martin, and I also had this feeling of the old cliche of the tears of the clown, the crying on the inside. But these were all kind of troubled individuals. That sort of felt very spooky. Were there any people who you thought sort of successfully managed to sort of go through that period unscathed, or was it all quite troubling?
Yeah, they all had their bad times. Even Eddie Murphy, who was kind of bulletproof for the first half of the 80s, then when he got into the second half of the 80s, had quite a tough time emotionally and was really struggling with stuff. And even he couldn't get his movies, when you get into the 90s and Beverly Hills Cop 3, that was a disastrous thing for him, and he hadn't experienced a flop like that before. Out of the guys that I profiled, really, Rick Moranis is probably the one that kind of got through it on an even keel, and then
gets punched in 2020.
And then he made it all the way to 2020. I mean, he had bad stuff happen to him. He had his wife die very young, sadly, of cancer, and retired. That was how he chose to kind of handle that situation, which I kind of really respect, because he could have gone on and carried on being a movie star, but he decided not to. But no, you're right. They all, maybe it's a comedian thing, maybe it's just part of being that famous, but they all had like huge down periods as well. They were struggling.
Of the films that you looked at, which were the ones that when you went back to? Because I remember growing up, I think we're this pretty much a similar generation. Going back to these films that you must remember from your youth, as from watching on television even. what were the ones that surprised you when you went back, that really stood up?
Well, I mean, the ones that stood up are the ones that I've kind of carried on watching. Like Three Amigos is one that I don't think enough people kind of celebrate, but that's a film that I absolutely love, that I have gone back to every few years. The same with Planes, Trains and Automobiles and The Man with Two Brains. Pennies from Heaven is one that actually I had not really appreciated until I got into this book. And Pennies from Heaven is an amazing Steve Martin. It's such a weird film, and he's not playing a very likable guy, but I was really impressed by that. I mean, one thing that struck me is some of these guys didn't make very many good films. Like John Candy is so beloved. Everyone loves John Candy, but you go back and really it's like a couple of 2 or 3 good movies, and the rest is really dodgy sort of dreck. So it's amazing that he kind of transcended the work that he did, because it wasn't that good.
Yeah, I mean, even if going back a little bit further, even John Belushi's hardly got. I mean, obviously they both died fairly young, but even the films that he made, 50% of them are fairly odd. I remember Neighbours being a particularly just strange, the miscasting of the two. How did you feel that was miscasting? Because Dan Aykroyd plays the wild and crazy neighbour, and John Belushi plays the straight man.
100%. I mean, I kind of respect what they did at the last minute, but I feel sorry for the director, John Avildsen, who wasn't really allowed to make that call himself. But I kind of admire the fact they wanted to switch things up, and that's another thing that I like about this period, is that they weren't just they got into sequels towards the end of the 80s, but these guys, if you look, generally they're not just doing the same shtick. They're trying different things, and Bill Murray would do a hilarious, crazy broad comedy, but then he'd go off and do a much more serious film, and they were really trying to push their personas in different ways. So going back to Neighbours, it's a dreadful film. It's an absolutely terrible film. It's borderline unwatchable. Really, I mean, there's some stuff in the book about the soundtrack and how that soundtrack came to be, but I mean, it's just a disaster. Continental Divide, people have been talking about a bit in the last week or so, because Michael Apted passed away, sadly, the director of that. And Continental Divide is worth a watch, I'd say. It's one of the better Belushi ones. It's flawed, but it's interesting. Actually, the first Amblin film ever made.
Oh, right. Okay.
But it's you're right, Belushi, Animal House, it doesn't really match, nothing he did after matched that.
Yeah.
Blues Brothers, of course, yeah, which is one of my favourite films. How can I forget? those two.
Blues Brothers. I saw Blues Brothers this summer. They showed it outdoors at a festival. John Landis introduced it, and it struck me it works much better as a musical than it does as a comedy. It just sort of as soon as you relax and think it's a musical. For me, it really works a lot, because otherwise the pacing is just feels so slow.
It's almost like an anti-comedy in a way, because you're right. You watch the Blues Brothers, and there are not many laugh out loud moments. There aren't many jokes. It's weirdness. It's the fact that Aykroyd's eating toast, and they're ordering strange meals, and so you're kind of chuckling along, but there aren't really hilarious jokes that people quote. There aren't one-liners. Obviously, Mission from God and Miles to Chicago and all that. There are iconic lines, but not really funny lines as such. And I mean, that movie cracked my head open. I saw that when I was 7 years old. I was on a holiday in Greece, and I saw it in an amphitheater. I saw it outside as well, and in a double bill with Beetlejuice. And I wasn't ready for it. I'd never seen anything like either of those films, and especially Blues Brothers. I didn't know what was going on. It's so strange, but I think you're right. You take the music out and it collapses, but then also if you take the action out, it probably collapses as well. So it's like this house of cards that just about works.
Yeah. And I mean, how would you compare the comedy of today with the cinema comedy that we see these days? Is there a continuation from the 80s, or has it totally changed, totally developed into something new?
I mean, there's a literal continuation in that we're getting a new Ghostbusters film, maybe this summer, and we're coming to America in a couple of months, and there's a Beverly Hills Cop 4 coming apparently, and so they are going back and rebooting and doing sequels to these films still, which is kind of amazing. But yeah, I mean, I feel personally the sense of experimentation has gone largely for comedy, and definitely that sense of comedians trying to change what they're doing and trying to try crazy new things. I think I really like Will Ferrell, but it's hard to argue that he doesn't do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Whereas Steve Martin was trying to change, or at least he was back then, trying to change what he does every time around. So yeah, I definitely feel comedy is not in a kind of glorious golden age like it was back then. At the moment, hopefully it'll come back, and also the studios are not putting big budgets behind these things. I mean, generally big budget comedy doesn't work because comedy is generally funnier when it's cheaper, I think, but something about Blues Brothers and Ghostbusters does work on that huge scale. Yeah, I'd like to see more of the insanity, although the studios probably don't want that.
Yeah.
They probably don't need the drugged up people running around.
Yeah, you've got to have that. You kind of got to have that excess as well in that carnival.
Yeah, it's just pure excess, these guys. I mean, whether it's John Candy like eating everything in sight, or it's Belushi snorting everything in sight. I mean, these guys lived like quite colourful lives, and that generally doesn't happen anymore, I think, for various reasons. You don't get these people rampaging around Hollywood.
Yeah, you can't imagine people with phone cameras, these days.
They'd be, there wasn't the same level of scrutiny, so they could kind of get away with it a bit more. But I mean, they were struggling with that even then, I think. After Ghostbusters came out, when they were like running for their lives, basically getting chased around by people, and it's much more like that these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So, will there be a follow-up to the book? I mean, would you like to take it into the 90s and the noughties and sort of follow the sort of development of comedy, or what are you working on next?
Well, I'm about coming up to a year into my next one, which is out in a couple of years, I'd say. And it's not a comedy one, actually. It's in the same vein, but more in the kind of the action mode. So yeah, that is proving a lot of fun to work on. And you can probably guess some of the kind of the characters in that, but they're kind of larger than life, even more so than these guys. And so yeah, that I'm having a great time kind of researching that. In terms of like comedy of the 90s, maybe I'm a huge fan of Jim Carrey, Mike Myers, not such a big Sandler fan. There's a couple of big Sandler fans at Empire, but I'm not one of them, so I don't know. I don't know if the group of people is quite as compelling to me, or the film. I don't quite love those films in the same way. But maybe one day. I'd love to read a book on Jim Carrey for sure.
No, absolutely. Well, listen, thanks very much, Nick, for talking to us. And I advise everyone to go out and buy and read Wild and Crazy Guys. Thanks very much, Nick.
Thanks, John.